Fantastic panelists today. Ushrit, who's someone who's been writing on the Middle East, Israel-India partnership, and of course is one of the new emerging voices that is shaping global debates in this region, in the West Asia and Indo-Pacific region. We have Lydia, who all of you probably know by now, and if you don't, then you should buy her hypersonic earrings that she does as a side hobby, even as she thinks about big security questions. And of course, Omneya is going to bring her experience on working on peace and security with a government institution, and of course before that. And Velina, my dear friend from Austria, who is the oracle when it comes to the finger on the pulse on matters of geopolitics. She had predicted when Russia would do certain things and when China will do certain things. So I'm going to let them do the talking. And Velina, let me start with you. And let me ask you a broad question. Sitting today, knowing what has happened over the last 3 years and what is happening in recent weeks, China, Taiwan, Ukraine, Russia, the Himalayan conflicts of a couple of years ago, muscularity all over, bipolarity, multipolarity, everything, working at the same point at the same moment. How secure is the world today? What for you are the big questions we need to address?
Many parts of the world operate differently. They have a different mindset. They don't want to get caught in these geopolitical struggles. They don't want to be caught by a binary world. They have to. They want to have different stories. They have also their own story that they want to push. But let's go back to the realities. And the reality is that the number of conflicts, the number of military conflicts, but also tensions in the world is unfortunately going to increase. We are actually at the threshold of a new, I think, big systemic conflict, a conflict between world systems, if you like. Once again, we are going to witness, unfortunately, a binarization, so bifurcation of the global order. On the one side, you have the West, on the other side, you have China with its partners, but what happens with the rest? And the reality right now is that in this transitionary period of the international affairs, you have all these relevant players in between that oscillate. They try to navigate in this increasing, I call it disorder. So we are entering a period of disorder. You named the main issues. We have a system decoupling between the major powers, United States and China. We are going to witness increasing tensions between the two Asian giants, China and India, because India is en route to becoming a major economic power with all the ramifications for the global system. We are witnessing the decline of Europe as a relevant actor. Of course, on the one side, still a relevant geoeconomic actor, but with very limited geopolitical...
There is a whole hula baloo in Europe that Eureka, we are now one, we are united, we have been in some sense forced to start thinking about security, start to behave like a political actor. You are actually arguing the opposite. Some would argue that this is the point that Europe might be rising as a political actor rather than declining.
In my world, with my estimations, you cannot be a relevant geopolitical actor without hard power. And the European Union, with the European powers, is still not this geopolitical actor, and I don't see a way how it's going to become one. So imposing sanctions, which was, the right thing to do following the invasion on February 24th, is not going to be efficient without international isolation. Russia, however, was not internationally isolated because in the meantime, Russia has already operated in other parts of the world and has forged alliances and partnerships with other regional partners. So the reality is that if the West does not realize that the European security order has been actually torpedoed on February 24th, and there is still no sense of urgency, there is still no perception that this has happened, I argue that they will be, punched in the face by realpolitik once when they realize that international actors in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa are moving forward. And our problems, our European problems are not their problems.
I think that was well articulated by the Indian Foreign Minister, that Europe needs to rethink of its own engagement with the world. But many in Africa and of course India and other parts of the world would argue that we don't have to oscillate. We are building our own space. And in our own space, it is not having to choose sides. It is having to have the best of all sides. And you had a non-alignment of the past. Do you see that there is a third space that will emerge? Or are you fatalistic and maybe European in that sense of having to choose one over another?
Well, in fact, Europe also doesn't want to get caught and doesn't want to side with the one or with the other, or let's say with the one against the other. So probably the good story out of all this disorder and chaos is that the third way would be one that goes in the direction of diversification. So diversification of supply chains, of value chains, other stories involving as many actors as possible along the whole, production line. And that would be a story where the European powers, but also India, but also African states, and of course other Asian, rising ASEAN region, a new, bloc that will see a lot of growth. Can offer as an alternative to a violent decoupling. And I think that systemic coexistence, that means that both system powers realize that a violence between them, a military conflict, will be disastrous for everyone. Would probably be the, let's say, best case scenario where, in this kind of decoupling, the gray zone in between will be occupied by all these alternative stories of success.
Lydia, with the proliferation of digital platforms, social media, weaponization of news, disinformation, individuals, non-state actors, bad actors have more power to destabilize societies, countries, economies than ever before. We are also seeing, and this is the global phenomenon, we are seeing an increase in polarization. And some of them are historic, which are being in many ways catalyzed to become more aggressive today. Others are artificially contrived, where there was no problem between communities, some seeds have been sown. How can we respond to this new security, in some sense, landscape?
Well, I think we first have to start with who's the we. How do we solve for this? And the we is not just the government, it's not just the companies, it's also societies and communities. And one, I think it starts with education. I think our societies need to be more educated about how algorithms work, how polarization can happen with these algorithms, so that they are better aware of when they see fake news, they can start to ask themselves, well, wait a minute, why is the algorithm giving me all of these things that look alike? Why is the algorithm giving me all these things that incite fear and hatred? So having that kind of self-awareness around that, I think, is a really important part for society to be more informed. And then I think government has a huge role to play in regulating some of these algorithms and how they work.
So let me hold you there. You said we, you conveniently removed government in your first part of response, and when it comes to action and responsibility, you quickly reintroduce government. That we does not include government, but when it comes to acting on the challenge, let's go back to the government. The question here is, why do we want the nation state to be the enforcer of an order, while we don't want it to be the regulator of the order?
Well, enforcement comes through the government. So when we say law enforcement, that law enforcement is done by government employees. I think the challenge is there's no simple answer here, and it's a little bit broader. But basically, governments have an important role to play with how we live our lives inside that sovereignty. And so therefore, we need to turn to governments to ask them to regulate more appropriately within our sovereign bounds, because we continue to live by the laws inside that territory.
But, just to extend this argument, because we are seeing this tension, countries are beginning to disconnect from each other. Do you think connectivity and actually the attack on connectivity, what I call the recession of globalization, is now seen as a viable political tool to respond to the challenges of fake news, polarization, influence operations, interference, whichever way? Are you seeing a certain attack inevitable on the connectivity that brought us all together as a global community?
No, not as such. I don't think that there's an attack on all of that. I don't think we can just cancel one app. That doesn't address the problem. The problem is that we have allowed algorithms to do what they will. We've allowed biases to take over. We've allowed this polarization. So at the beginning you can say, oh, well, we weren't aware of this. We didn't know that this happens. But we are well past that point of awareness. And so now is the point where we say canceling an app or not allowing a certain website in a country does not solve for these kinds of tensions that arise. We need to face them and say we do need to have some hard conversations, and it's completely natural for nations to have disputes within them and for many societies inside one nation to have some grievances that need to be resolved. We are ignoring some of those things, and we can't entirely just blame a digital big tech company for all of that.
Given the recent changing dynamics in the Middle East, is this projecting a new way to approach crisis and security threats? In the Middle Eastern experience of the recent past, is that giving us a path ahead?
I think the strict and the hyper-strategic alliance that characterized the region of the Middle East during the Cold War era are now vanishing. And it seems like a new order is emerging. That is much more hybrid, unpredictable, but at the same time, hybrid, unpredictable, but sometimes very much pragmatic, especially when it comes to the economic front. And when people are talking today about the Abraham Accords, so everybody talking about the effect of the Abraham Accords now on the region, but I think the question, and the fair question that should be asked, is how the region got changed that the Abraham Accords became possible. And that takes us to the Arab Spring in 2011, when the citizens of the countries in Libya and Egypt and Syria were protesting against the government. And then, if we take a look at what's happening in the Gulf, for example, we saw how the leaders of the Gulf countries they try to understand how they can give more to the people in order to battle the economic challenges in the future. And then we saw this beginning of thinking how we can cooperate with Israel and what they have in stake when it comes to cooperation with Israel. And but the most important thing that happened with the Arab awakening is that the people actually were demonstrating, and I think it was the loss of fear of the people. And they were demanding more from the government. They were demanding more, better economic goods, better services, better governments. And this actually made the change. So when it comes to that, I think that Israel can provide, when it comes to food security, to climate change, to all of that, to cybersecurity as well, Israel can be a good solution.
And this is a lesson for other regions as well. But Velina, depending on Russia for energy did not keep peace in Europe. So, economic reasons might be motivating the Abraham Accords, but your gas pipelines have not necessarily resulted in peace.
Exactly. And the other thing is, once again, diversification, because first, American withdrawal from the Middle East was the major factor for regional actors to get involved with each other, to fill the vacuum, to actually, deal with the chaos by the most significant external power leaving behind, right?
Yes.
So I argue that, of course, Arab Spring was significant, new generation, new demands, also going back to the digital, connecting people. People are looking how other people are getting all these services at home, and they started demanding. But the geopolitical dimension was the one that now we are in a situation where Saudi Arabia is even considering dealing with Iran and normalizing relations with Israel because of the lack of a significant geopolitical player as
an external actor.
And then again, the dragon bear is on the ground. China being the trading, trade partner number one in terms of exports of
dragon bear is Velina's reference to Russia and China in one word.
And Russia, of course, has a solid military presence. So what I'm trying to say is that we should also be mindful of, shifting geopolitical formations, partnerships at the meta level. So,
add something to what you said. I think you're right, of course, there's the geopolitical effect. China is involved, and Russia involvement in the region, and the fear of these countries that United States is about to withdraw from the region. But then we started to hear from Arab leaders starting talking that Israel is here to stay, and this is why we need to cooperate with Israel.
We also have this new West Asian Quad, I2U2. How can such groupings, for example, work with regions such as Africa? How can a West Asian Quad, for example, or India and Israel partnership serve the African continent?
Well, I think the word is going to multilateral, multidimensional trend, and joining the right partnership, it's true for our private life, is the most important decision we can do, but it's also true when it comes to a country and when it comes to a continent, and I think Africa should join a bigger alliance, a bigger group, and the world should provide its option. And if we think about Africa, Africa is the second largest continent, so much potential for growth and development. And if we look at India and Israel, both countries has a lot to offer to Africa. And actually, in 2017, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Israel, Netanyahu was saying both were looking to work together with the third countries, and he mentioned Africa, and that was very surprising at the time. Why we would work with Africa? We were just engaging, we were just promoting our relationship, and as we know, India is already working here at infrastructure project and other projects. But Israel is trying to, as well, in the last decades, to enhance its relations with Africa. And if we talk about how these countries can collaborate and help Africa, I think there are two models. One of them, I call it the triangular model, with India, Israel, Africa, and the I2U2 plus A, plus Africa, we can call it. And in both models, we can talk about agri-tech and defense and security. So, but working together, India and Israel can actually help offer Africa good equipment with Israeli brand, but in good prices that matching to Africa. And when it comes to agri-tech, I think that Africa is a fertile country. We have good climate. We have as well human resources, good potential. And both countries, we all know the Israeli technology, the irrigation technology, and water waste management, all can be used with Indian financing to help Africa to have better agriculture, but not mini agriculture, not family agriculture, but a bigger agriculture, but not, and also help Africa to actually replace Ukraine's role in the food chain system that we know now is problematic. But the added value that Israel and India can bring is not only to help Africa to sell its products to the world, but also be able to help Africa to build its agriculture industry.
These are the big pictures that we were discussing. But in reality, it's about human beings. How do we look at human security in a new light? Human trafficking, smuggling of immigrants. It's rampant across Asia and Africa, both continents. And it causes terrible situations. Many a times it has terrible geopolitical outcomes. How do we respond to this challenge? How can we work together on this?
Speaking of people caught in between, so Africa, so there is a conversion of problems in Africa, as you rightfully mentioned, and other panelists as well. Climate, conflict, displacement, disasters, natural disasters. And the problem is not the fact that they are in this compounded nature of these problems, it's in the fact that they are protracted. They're not going anywhere, they're not expected to be temporary. And so crisis management interventions, short-term projects and interventions are not efficient, they're not effective. And so Africa is starting to think about the fragility problem, the resilience building in response to this, and working on that. And so The issue with fragility is that it's linked to climate change because it is a multiplier, it's an amplifier of fragility. And this link, for example, between climate change and conflict, even though it might not be established properly yet by evidence, the link with displacement, for example, is. And so in response to this, it is important to build the synergies of government and local response. But the issue is that conflict, when you speak about climate adaptation efforts, the national contributions, the NDCs, you cannot really tackle these issues, you cannot really improve on them when you have conflict-affected settings. And climate change is detrimental for already fragile contexts as conflict-ridden countries and regions in Africa. And so it is important that, one, we build the synergies and the strategic alignment between peacebuilding and peacekeeping communities and the climate communities when we're tackling the responses, but also to improve climate finance for conflict-affected settings. Mm-hmm. And these are increasing in Africa. They are, by the day and the month. For example, the numbers show that the access of fragile or conflict-ridden countries to climate finance today is 1 to 80 mm-hmm. of the available funding for other countries that are not fragile or not conflict-ridden. There is this focus on fragility, tackling and resilience building, and that takes us to community-based solutions. It takes us to building institutions in Africa, and governance has been a challenge for years. Mm-hmm. And institutions, I mean, not only central within the central government, but also on the local level and the communities. So that takes us to capacity building and knowledge transfer, which takes us, I'm sorry, I'm taking you through the challenges. It takes us to knowledge and data. So how can you build the capacity to plan interventions and responses to various threats that you mentioned and others, including, of course, climate, without having
information and knowledge and data.
And currently, as we speak, there are no data sets that look at basic issues such as, for example, environmental migration across Africa. Even though we have 32 forcibly displaced people in Africa as we speak, including almost nearly 8 million, 32 million, including nearly 8 million refugees.
So let me ask you, I think when you have millions of climate refugees, no country should believe that they are safe. I think when people move, there is friction in that very large motion that will unfold over the coming decades. So in your center, have you seen examples or institutions or cases outside where you see hope of creating frameworks to manage this?
So let me take you back just a minute to the term climate refugees. At the moment, even though there has been a fierce debate on the global level, climate refugees are not a legal term. There are displacements, but to link them, again, we need scientific evidence. To link them to climate and to natural disasters that are framed as climate change hazards. That said, yes, there is a big movement, and there are responses on the African level for this. Africa, as we speak, is formulating a common position vis-à-vis climate and security, which will include focus on, or expected to include, focus on migration. And has in the past attempted to tackle this through various policy documents. But at the end, it goes back to the issue of both central planning, which includes capacities and cooperation between African countries, but also resources. The issue of resources, of course, with the effect of COVID-19 is just really slowing down the response to both the migration and including the refugee issue, but also overall development issue. And let me add that it is expected by global or international estimations that by 2050, in sub-Saharan Africa alone, it is expected to be 85 million people just forced to leave out their houses and be displaced by climate risk, which is a big number. So talking about efforts to tackle the resilience, to improve the resilience and tackle fragility in Africa is just, is not a luxury anymore. it is something that has to be tackled right now. Otherwise, the scale of the problem is sometimes beyond our ability to foresee it.
So I want to bring in questions from the audience.
I want to just say that I also think that there's a failure of imagination here when you talked about how the implications are far broader than we can even understand or fathom. I think we need to spend a lot more time talking about that. And we also don't really talk about systems thinking. We take climate change and we put it in a silo, and then we put another issue like agri-tech in a silo. Or digital, and we put these, like we say, oh, they're verticals or they're horizontals, but actually, if we should just throw all that away and say they're a kaleidoscope. When you look into a kaleidoscope, everything starts to merge with each other.
I would like to attract the panelists to talk about a little bit on governance as an aspect that would provide a solution to issues of security, but also that undermines security in some instances. And how we pride ourselves in innovation, but seems like governance is the area that you have decided not to innovate. Yet it is the critical aspect in societies.
The kind of insecurity that is created by this pragmatic partnerships, I'd like you to talk about that. You know, a pragmatic partnership between India, Israel, and African countries might work to build trust between those three states. It doesn't necessarily help to build trust between African states and their citizens.
Maybe we can start with Omneya, and then we can go down the panel after that.
Okay, well, I think I've spoken about the risks, long enough, but I can mention a good initiative as a best practice, which is the African Mobility Initiative, and it had succeeded in creating a model where they can anticipate where the hot zones for migrations in migration in Africa can be, especially when it comes to climate risk. Driven migration, and this model it's an example of a scientific approach to foresight and early warning, and it's now being implemented across the continent. So of course the system is as good as the information you feed into it. Well, trust, it's linked to all the policies that we would like to see implemented in Africa, isn't it? Including inclusive and sustainable response to climate change and other related risks. When you want to have the buy-in of local communities, you need to have the trust, and you need to have the representation and their opinion heard.
Yes, I think that it's still very much state to state, let's say institutions to state relations, which is wrong, and it needs to regard the new realities that societies in African countries are becoming more active, becoming more involved in politics and economics due to also the technological revolution. And this is, I think, probably is going to be the major threshold to be overcome in this process. I also do not agree with this common approach that all are put in the one pot. That means that if, for instance, Europe comes with a concrete proposal, let's say the infrastructure project, the infrastructure project as opposed to China's Belt and Road initiative involves 150 billion euro that are meant specifically for Africa. But if you start asking the European institutions how this money is going to be spent, in which countries, what kind of priorities, nobody can tell. So, of course, this top-down, highly institutionalized approach is often, I think, also not the best solution. We probably should think of a triad of citizens, governments, and institutions. I think that this would be the best way to approach the issue in the future.
Yes, I agree with that triad. Something I'd like to bring from earlier this morning, a speaker reminded us, a speaker from Kenya, that the continent is made out of 54 countries that are all very different and have different political and climate realities. And so we cannot at all lump them all in the same box. Also, though, what I would say is that to that triad that you spoke to, I also think that the government has a role to play to stand up for the needs of each country as they relate to dealing with other governments and organizations. And finally, with the climate aspects that you were talking about, I couldn't agree more, and something that I think we didn't bring up is the rising coast on the west side of Africa. We've talked about droughts and all these other things, but we forget about how certain land is maybe not going to be around in that 2050 timeframe, and how do you prepare for that as well?
Great. So I think that brings us to the close, and I think we've had a good conversation on a vast range of issues. Food for thought for all of us to take back. This is not a security conference, but we wanted to really bring this into the fray so that we understand that everything we aspire for in terms of our development and growth ambitions is happening in a backdrop of a world that is facing other challenges as well. And with this, please join me in applauding this panel. And thank you very much for coming and joining us here.